The Earth is art. The photographer is only a witness. Jan Arthus Bertrand. In this episode, Tessa and I will have a look at this Kawanon 35mm f2.5 lens to see if it's any good. We will also give it a CLV score at the end, so keep watching for that. But first, let's start with its features and handling. The lens was likely introduced in the early 1960s, or perhaps in the mid-1960s. Detailed information is hard to come by, as it is a very rare lens. The company that manufactured it is Kawakami Saimitsu Kikai Seisakusho. There are 6 elements in 5 groups, as Kato Beck's lens catalog helpfully tells us. The aperture closes down to f22 and clicks at every full stop. And also at f2.8. But it's a preset aperture, which means there are 2 rings for adjusting the aperture. One ring determines how far you can close the aperture, and the other allows you to adjust it continuously between wide open and that preset value. The advantage of this is that you can switch very quickly between wide open and, for example, f8. However, the downside is that you may have to turn 2 rings to change the aperture. Overall, I find it rather annoying. But what isn't annoying, in fact it's a feature I'd love to see more of in vintage lenses, is the 12-blade aperture. The minimum focus distance is 1 meter, which is a lot for a 35mm lens. The filter diameter is 52mm and it weighs 185 grams. The focus ring turns a generous 270 degrees, which, at least in this case, is a bit too much for me. Because of the kind of difficult optical performance this lens exhibits, I found it difficult to focus properly at all. And when you also have to turn the focus ring a long way, the joy of manual focusing turns into a chore. But we'll get to the image quality in a moment. On top of that, the adjustment rings turn in the Nikon direction, which is the wrong direction for me. We will be testing the lens on a Sony A7 III and this Fuji GFX50S. On the Fuji, it's equivalent to a full-frame lens with a focal length of roughly 28mm and a maximum aperture of f2. Let's start with the image quality test by looking at distortion and vignetting on this Adobe camera calibration chart. There's a bit of barrel distortion, but nothing too serious. Vignetting is quite strong at f2.5 and still a bit noticeable by f5.6. You can correct both distortion and vignetting in your editing software, of course, but you could also use the lens profiles I offer for download on my Patreon page. Lateral chromatic aberration is very visible, but can still quite easily be corrected in software. Longitudinal chromatic aberration is low. At least that's what I think, because it's probably masked to some extent by presumably spherical aberration. Which also is clearly visible here, where we are testing for color fringing. The good news, though, is that we have virtually none of the latter. On the GFX camera, the lens produces black corners, but certain aspect ratios or a slight crop still make it usable. Let's now turn to sharpness at infinity on the A7. Wide open and in the middle of the frame, the image appears very blurry and hazy. At f4 there's still a bit of that, but we have very good sharpness here. And it gets a little better before it gets softer again at f16 and f22. Halfway to the corner, the image quality is already noticeably worse. We don't achieve good sharpness here until f8. The corners themselves are even weaker. The best performance is at f11, but you couldn't even call it good. Here we test sharpness at minimum focus distance. Since it's a full meter, we can at least see a large portion of the test map at once. The sharpness characteristics in the middle are similar to those at infinity. We get very good sharpness at f4, though contrast is still a bit low there. f5.6 is even better, and f16 and f22 are softer again. Unfortunately, the corners are just as obscure as the web of third-party lens brands and manufacturers from the 60s, 70s and 80s. Now it's time for sharpness at portrait distance. Because of the high minimum focusing distance, this time it's more of a half-body portrait, but hopefully that still counts. The results are similar to before. Soft at f2.5, becoming sharper and then softening again as the aperture is fully closed. Here we're testing the bokeh of the lens on a GFX camera. It looks nice right in the center of the image, however, the further you move away from the center, the worse it gets, and the bokeh balls become quite irregular in shape. Field curvature is also noticeable here, primarily due to the larger GFX sensor. We have reached the end of the technical tests and are now looking at Coma and sunstars. Coma is strong wide open and almost tamed by 5.6. At this point, sunstars begin to form, which, thanks to the 12-bladed aperture, look really nice. Now let's see how our findings hold up in real life. Here are a few sample shots, all taken in Berlin, with both the Sony and the Fuji. Enjoy! And now for the CLV score. For handling and features, it's a 4. Also for aberrations. For sharpness, it gets a 2, because we assume that there are lenses which are even worse. The bokeh suffers from the high minimum focus distance, beneath other things, therefore gets a 3. The beautiful sunstars deserve an 8. Judging its value is difficult since it's nowhere on offer. I think I paid 50 euros, which is actually a bit too much for what you get. 25 out of 60 points, that's a new record. Thanks for watching everyone, and please consider liking and subscribing.